The sun was slowly slipping behind the Pequod Mountains, painting the Nevada desert sky in hues of fire and farewell. The cracked ground, hot all day, was beginning to cool, and the wind whispered through the brittle chaparral like it carried ancient secrets. Lying on the rough earth, in the melancholy silence of dusk, a newborn mustang colt named Finnick fought to keep his eyes open. His fragile body barely breathed. He was alone, left behind by his herd, perhaps because he was sick, or maybe just too weak to keep up. In the wild, survival is merciless. Abandonment isn't always cruelty, it's nature's way of moving on. Just a few yards away, a pale figure cut across the land like a ghost. A wolf. Majestic, his coat as white as melted snow, eyes sharp as winter steel. His name was Branwyn, and he moved in absolute silence, muscles flowing beneath his thick fur like the workings of a finely tuned machine. Instinct led him. He could smell weakness, the scent of something near the end. Finnick seemed to sense him too, but didn't try to move. He couldn't. His half-lidded eyes showed more than fear. They showed surrender. He knew what was coming. And the world, for one breathless moment, seemed to hold still and watch. Branwyn crept closer, sniffing the air, stopping just in front of the colt. The space between them felt almost sacred. Nature, usually so quick to act, hesitated. And then something happened that defied everything. Branwyn lowered his head and, instead of sinking his teeth into the frail neck of his prey, he licked it. Gently, carefully, with a tenderness that didn't belong in the laws of the wild. It was as if something greater than instinct had stirred within him, some spark of compassion that no one would ever expect from a predator. Finnick, struggling, lifted his head slightly. Their eyes met. In that gaze was something heavy, an unspoken exchange between two living beings who knew loneliness, who understood pain. Branwyn laid down beside the colt, not as a threat, not as a hunter waiting for death, but as a guardian. The light of day slipped away slowly, but the warmth of that moment seemed to hold something alive between them. No blood, no violence, just an impossible truce, wrapped in silence. From a rock nearby, a vulture watched. Its wings still, its eyes sharp. Even it couldn't make sense of what was happening. And vultures see everything. Off in the distance, the hum of an old pickup truck rolled down a dirt road. Thatcher Boone, a 68-year-old rancher, drove that way every evening. He didn't own much land anymore, but habit and heart kept him coming back. He often said the desert had eyes, and sometimes, when no one else was watching, it revealed miracles. And that day, he was about to witness one. Night fell hard, and the cold crept low across the sand. But Branwyn didn't move. Finnick, still breathing in shallow bursts, lowered his head again, closer now to the one who just moments ago seemed destined to end his life. The desert fell silent once more. But this time, it was a different kind of silence. It carried something new. Something no one, not Thatcher, not the vulture, could ever explain. And what happened in the hours that followed would change everything. Thatcher Boone stepped out of his truck, the desert air cooler now that the sun had dropped behind the hills. He had come down this road 1,000 times, but something tonight felt different. He noticed the hoofprints first, small, unsteady, too light to belong to a full-grown horse. Then came the paw prints. Bigger. A wolf. He followed them, his flashlight sweeping over dry brush and dust until it caught something strange, a pale shape curled around a darker one near a dead tree. As he stepped closer, the beam revealed it, Branwyn, a white wolf, lying beside a barely breathing colt. Finnick. No signs of attack. No blood on the wolf's muzzle. Just stillness. He stopped several feet away, heart quiet but heavy. Branwyn didn't flinch. His eyes were fixed on Thatcher, calm and alert. Finnick let out a faint breath, legs twitching slightly. It was clear the colt was hurt. There was blood caked around one leg, dried and dark. Thatcher crouched, keeping a respectful distance. He'd seen wolves in the wild before, but never one like this. This wolf wasn't hunting. He was guarding. The thought chilled him more than any threat. "What are you doing out here, old boy?" Thatcher muttered. "And what in God's name are you doing with him?" Slowly, he reached into his truck coat and pulled out a folded wool blanket. He laid it gently a few feet from Finnick, watching Branwyn closely. The wolf didn't move, didn't growl, just kept his eyes on the man like he understood something deeper than instinct. Thatcher didn't know what to do. Touch the colt and risk breaking this strange peace? Or walk away and hope the night didn't take him? He looked at Finnick again. The little mustang's breathing was weak, shallow. If help didn't come soon, the cold would finish what nature had started. Thatcher had seen death before. He'd buried animals, friends, even his wife. But something about this scene, it held him. There was meaning here. Maybe not one he could explain, but one he felt deep in his chest. A part of him wanted to believe this was just nature being unpredictable. But another part, the quieter one he usually ignored, whispered that this was more than survival. It was connection. Between two creatures that shouldn't share anything, yet somehow did. He rose slowly, brushing dust off his jeans. He needed to get supplies, salve, water, maybe something to make a shelter if he stayed. But leaving the colt alone, even for a short time, made him hesitate. Would the wolf still be there when he came back? Would Finnick? And what if something changed in the air between them the second he turned his back? He studied Branwyn for a long moment. The wolf blinked, slow and deliberate. It didn't feel like permission. It felt like trust. Thatcher turned, walking back toward the truck, boots crunching softly in the sand. Every few steps, he looked over his shoulder. They were still there, one broken, the other wild, both clinging to the same thread of life. As he reached the driver's side, he paused and whispered, "Don't let him go, you hear?" He didn't know if the wolf could understand. But something told him the message landed anyway. And before the night was done, something in this desert would shift forever. The desert grew colder than Thatcher had expected. Even wrapped in his old flannel and with the heater humming inside the truck, he could feel the chill seeping into his bones. He watched the tree line in the distance, headlights off, engine idling low. He didn't drive away. Couldn't. Something about leaving the colt out there alone, well, not alone exactly, but out there, didn't sit right with him. He'd gathered what little he had, a jug of water, some antiseptic, bandages left over from a calf injury last spring. Not enough, but it was better than nothing. He glanced again toward the ridge. They were still out there. And in a world that moved fast and cruel, that was something. Back at the tree, Finnick hadn't moved much. His breathing was shallow, but steady. The blanket Thatcher had left earlier was pulled slightly tighter around him, though the old man couldn't figure how. Maybe the wind. Maybe Branwyn. The wolf still lay beside him, silent and watchful, his white coat almost glowing in the moonlight. Thatcher approached slowly this time, not wanting to disturb the strange peace that had formed in the dust. He knelt by the colt, gently brushing the blanket aside to examine the leg. The wound hadn't worsened, but the swelling worried him. Infection was a real threat. And out here, time was no one's friend. As he cleaned the wound with warm water and antiseptic, Finnick flinched. Barely. The colt was too weak to protest, but his eyes opened, just for a second, meeting Thatcher's. There was no panic there, just exhaustion. Thatcher whispered softly, like he used to with his old mare when she was dying. "You're all right now, little guy. Stay with me." He glanced at Branwyn, expecting some reaction, some flick of an ear or growl of warning. But the wolf didn't move. His gaze was calm, trusting. Thatcher couldn't help but feel the weight of it. Whatever Branwyn was, he wasn't just a wolf. Not tonight. He wrapped the colt's leg carefully, tucking the bandage under itself, hands steady despite the cold. The silence around them was deeper than before, less like stillness, more like purpose. The stars above stretched wide and endless, and Thatcher felt suddenly small beneath them. Not weak, just aware. As if the land itself had decided this moment mattered. As if it had chosen him to be here, to see it, to do something. He sat back, knees stiff, and studied the wolf again. Branwyn blinked once, slowly, then returned his gaze to the colt. A silent sentinel. A living mystery. Thatcher didn't sleep. He laid out a bedroll a few yards away, kept the fire low, and listened to the distant cries of coyotes echoing off the canyon walls. Branwyn never left Finnick's side. Every so often, the colt would stir, letting out a weak whinny, and Thatcher would check on him. Hours passed like pages turning in a book no one wrote. And just before dawn, something changed. Finnick tried to sit up. He didn't make it far, legs trembling, breath ragged, but it was enough. Enough for hope to crack through the cold. Thatcher stood and walked over, kneeling beside him. "You're fighting," he whispered. "That's good. That's real good." But as he reached to steady Finnick, Branwyn suddenly stood too, posture tight, head turned toward the ridge. Ears alert, eyes narrowed. Something had changed in the wind. Something was coming. Thatcher turned instinctively, scanning the horizon, but saw only dark silhouettes of trees and brush. Still, he felt it too. A shift. And for the first time since this strange vigil began. Branwyn looked uneasy. The first light of morning painted the desert in pale shades of gold and gray. The chill hadn't lifted yet, and Thatcher Boone could feel the cold in his joints as he stood up slowly, stretching stiff legs. Across from him, Branwyn remained perfectly still, his body tense, his ears angled sharply toward the far edge of the ridge. Finnick, still wrapped in the worn blanket, had calmed again after his earlier attempt to rise. But something had shifted. Even the birds were silent. It was the kind of stillness that didn't feel natural, like the land itself had paused, waiting to see what would happen next. Thatcher reached for his binoculars, scanning the landscape. The horizon looked empty. No dust trails, no movement, no sound. But his gut said otherwise. He'd learned long ago to trust that feeling, the one that whispered when something wasn't right. Branwyn took 2 steps forward, his breath puffing visibly in the cold air. Then he stopped and growled. Low. Barely audible. But it wasn't directed at Thatcher or Finnick. It was aimed at the silence itself. The kind of growl that meant warning. Not of hunger, not of territory, but danger. Thatcher narrowed his eyes. Something, or someone, was out there. And the wolf knew it first. He moved quickly but quietly, placing himself between Finnick and the open land ahead. He didn't carry a rifle anymore, not since the accident years ago, but part of him wished he had something more than a pocket knife. "What is it, boy?" he muttered, mostly to himself. Branwyn's gaze didn't break. Whatever was coming, it hadn't arrived yet, but it was close enough for him to feel it. The sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows. That unease, Thatcher couldn't shake it. And worse, it wasn't just fear for his own safety. It was something deeper. A sense that this fragile balance between predator, prey, and man was about to be tested. A sudden rustle in the brush made Thatcher turn sharply. His heart jumped, but it was only a jackrabbit bolting into the distance. Still, Branwyn didn't relax. The tension in his posture remained, and now his tail was low, his body lowered slightly, as if preparing for something. It was a side of the wolf Thatcher hadn't seen until now. Not calm, not curious, alert, protective. Thatcher turned to Finnick, whose breathing was steadier but shallow. The colt was surviving, maybe even improving, but in this moment that made him more vulnerable. The old man knew how the wild worked. When one animal showed weakness, others noticed. Not all of them showed mercy. The wind picked up again, carrying with it a new scent, dry, musky, unfamiliar. Thatcher's instincts lit up. He knew that smell. Not animal. Human. Someone else was out here. Someone who didn't belong. He stepped back slowly, eyes scanning the horizon one more time, but nothing moved. Branwyn's growl deepened slightly. And in that shared silence between man and beast, a new, invisible line was drawn. This wasn't just about survival anymore. Something else had entered the story. Something that didn't care about wolves or colts, or old men who still believed the desert could show you something holy. Thatcher Boone felt the shift before he saw it. The desert, always quiet in the early morning, had turned uneasy. Even the wind had gone still. Branwyn stood tense, eyes locked on the ridge. Finnick lay curled beside the fire, still breathing, still fighting. But something had entered their space, something wrong. Thatcher could smell it before he saw the man. Dust, old sweat, and gun oil. It was the scent of someone who didn't belong. He stood slowly, watching the horizon. Then, through the haze of heat, a figure appeared. A man in dark clothes. Moving slow. Too slow. He wasn't a rancher. He wasn't lost. That much was clear from the rifle slung across his back. Thatcher narrowed his eyes. The man wasn't hiding. He wanted to be seen. That made it worse. Branwyn stepped forward, growling low, throat rumbling like thunder caught in a cave. The stranger stopped about 30 yards away. "Morning," he called out. His voice was dry, empty of emotion. Thatcher didn't respond. He stood tall, placing himself between the stranger and the colt. The wolf stayed at his side, silent but ready. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight. The man nodded toward Branwyn. "You know that's a wolf, right?" he said, like it was news. "Could be dangerous." Thatcher didn't move. "He hasn't hurt anyone," he answered calmly. "He's protecting that foal." The man laughed, but it didn't sound real. "Or waiting for it to die. Wolves are smart like that." He stepped closer. Branwyn let out a deeper growl now, one that sent chills down Thatcher's back. "You need to stop right there," Thatcher warned, voice firmer now. The stranger paused. Something passed between them, an invisible tension, sharp and quiet. For a moment, it felt like the desert itself held its breath. The stranger glanced at Finnick, then back at the wolf. "Looks like trouble found you," he said flatly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Slow, like he had all the time in the world. Thatcher didn't relax. He stood frozen, eyes fixed on the man until the figure vanished behind the rocks. Only then did he feel the tightness in his chest begin to ease. Branwyn didn't move until the silence returned completely. But neither of them trusted it. Thatcher knelt beside Finnick and rested a hand on his side. The colt stirred, weak but alive. The air was still thick with tension. That man, whoever he was, wasn't done. Thatcher knew the type. He'd come back. Maybe not today. Maybe not alone. And next time, the desert might not be so forgiving. The sun rose higher, but the warmth did little to ease the weight in Thatcher Boone's chest. The man was gone, for now, but his presence lingered like smoke in the air. Every sound, every shift of the wind felt like a threat waiting to take form. Branwyn had returned to his place beside Finnick, but his body remained tense, ears flicking at every noise. The colt had drifted into a shallow sleep, head resting near the wolf's side, and though his breathing was steady, Thatcher knew they were far from safe. The stranger's words echoed in his mind. "Trouble found you." And he was right. It had. The question now was how much worse it would get. Thatcher spent the morning gathering firewood and boiling water, anything to keep his hands moving. Every few minutes, He looked to the ridge. No movement. No sound. But the quiet no longer felt peaceful. It felt like something waiting. Branwyn never relaxed fully, his golden eyes tracking the landscape as if expecting it to open and spit out something dark. Thatcher had seen wolves before, aggressive, cautious, territorial, but never like this. This one acted like a soldier. Calm, controlled, dangerous when needed, and loyal. That last part was what haunted Thatcher the most. Why had the wolf stayed? Why protect a half-dead colt and an aging rancher with nothing left to give? By midday, Finnick tried to stand again. He made it halfway before collapsing gently back down. But this time, there was no panic in his movement, just effort. Thatcher watched closely, a quiet pride forming in his chest. "You've got some fight in you, kid," he muttered, brushing dust from the colt's neck. Branwyn moved with him, staying close, always between Finnick and the open land. That protective wall never wavered. And somewhere deep inside, Thatcher began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. 4 years, he'd wandered these deserts alone, haunted by memories too heavy to name. But now, in this fragile circle of life and death, something had shifted. He wasn't just witnessing survival, he was part of it. Still, the unease never left. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the desert in soft gold and fading blue, Thatcher looked once more toward the ridge. Nothing. But he could feel it: he'll come back. He didn't know when or how, but he knew the stranger wasn't done. And when he returned, the test wouldn't be just for the colt or the wolf, it would be for him. For who he still was beneath all the silence and the loss. The night was coming again. And with it, more than just darkness. The wind picked up just after sunset. It wasn't loud, but it carried grit and memory through the desert like an old ghost. Thatcher sat by the low-burning fire, staring at the flames as they danced in silence. Finnick lay curled beneath the blanket, his breathing stronger now, though still uneven. Every hour, he tried to lift his head, and every hour, he managed to hold it up just a little longer. Branwyn remained close, not resting, not blinking for long. The wolf barely moved, except to scan the horizon every few minutes, like a soldier guarding a sacred post. And Thatcher, he felt it too. The stillness wasn't peace anymore. It was warning. Earlier that afternoon, he'd found fresh boot prints near the base of the ridge. Not his. Not old. The man had returned, watched them again, then left without a word. That kind of patience wasn't natural. It was calculated. Thatcher had lived too long to ignore signs written in dirt. He'd gone back to the truck, checking the old revolver locked under the passenger seat. He hadn't fired a weapon in over a decade, but the weight in his hand felt familiar. He hated the idea of using it, but he hated even more the idea of not being ready. This place, this moment, they weren't ordinary. And whatever was coming, it wouldn't be solved with kindness. As night deepened, Thatcher moved closer to Finnick, laying a second blanket over him, checking the wrappings on his leg. The swelling had gone down slightly, but the colt still couldn't stand without trembling. Still, he looked at Thatcher now with more focus. There was something in his eyes: recognition, trust, maybe even hope. "You're a fighter, I'll give you that," Thatcher whispered. Branwyn shifted slightly, as if acknowledging the words. The old man glanced at the wolf and shook his head. "Never thought I'd be sharing a fire with something like you." He paused. "But I'm glad you stayed." In that quiet moment, with desert shadows stretching around them, the three of them felt less like strangers and more like survivors, bound not by words, but by need. Then, off in the distance, something cracked. Not the wind. Not an animal. Wood. A branch. Snapped. Thatcher stood slowly, hand drifting to the revolver at his waist. Branwyn rose too, his body rigid, fur bristling. Finnick stirred but didn't rise. The air thickened with tension. Nothing moved in the dark, but something was out there. Watching. Waiting. Thatcher's jaw clenched. "Stay close," he muttered, not sure who he was speaking to anymore. The fire popped softly, casting long shadows behind him. And somewhere beyond the light, the desert held its breath again. Thatcher stood still, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. The snap of a branch echoed in his ears, louder than it should have. Branwyn was beside him, alert, body tense, ready to defend. Finnick remained curled beneath the blankets, head low, unaware of what was coming. The air had shifted. Thatcher felt it deep in his bones. Someone was out there. Not a coyote. Not a hiker. A man. The same man. And this time, he wasn't just watching. He was approaching. Thatcher's hand gripped the revolver at his waist. He hadn't used it in years, but tonight wasn't about skill. It was about protecting what was his. And somehow, this colt, this wolf, this moment, had become his. The fire cracked behind him, and in the silence that followed, he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving through dry brush. Thatcher raised his voice, firm but calm. "You don't want this." No answer. Only more steps. Branwyn growled low, steady, his body moving between the sound and the colt without hesitation. A shape appeared at the edge of the fire's glow. The stranger. Hat low, eyes hidden, rifle strapped across his chest. He didn't raise it, yet. Just stood there, watching. "Didn't think you'd stay," the man said. His voice was flat, cold. "Didn't think the mutt would either." Thatcher didn't move. "You need to leave." The man tilted his head. "That's a wild animal and a dying horse. You think they're worth dying for?" Thatcher didn't blink. "Yeah," he said. "I do." Silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight. Then the man's hand twitched toward the strap. Branwyn leapt. Fast as lightning, teeth bared. The man stumbled back, caught off guard, raising his arm too late. Thatcher stepped forward, gun drawn but not fired. Everything happened in seconds. Shouts, snarls, movement in the dark. Then, just as fast, it was over. The man backed off, bleeding, retreating into the dark without a word. Thatcher lowered his weapon slowly. Branwyn stood still, eyes glowing in the firelight. And Thatcher knew this wasn't finished. The desert was silent again, but not peaceful. The fire burned low, casting flickers of orange against the dust. Thatcher stood still, eyes scanning the ridge where the man had vanished. His heart was pounding, but his hands didn't shake. Not yet. Branwyn had returned to Finnick's side, watching the horizon with the same cold focus. The stranger was gone, but the threat still lingered. Thatcher didn't know if the man would come back, or if this place had finally taught him to walk away. Either way, he couldn't relax. Not until morning. Maybe not even then. Finnick stirred under the blanket. He hadn't moved during the confrontation, too weak, too tired. But now his eyes opened slowly. He looked up at Thatcher, then at Branwyn. For the first time, he tried to rise without help. His legs shook, but he pushed himself halfway up, ears twitching. Thatcher moved to steady him, but stopped. The colt stood, shaky, but standing. It wasn't graceful, and it wouldn't last long, but it was enough. Enough to bring a lump to Thatcher's throat. "Attaboy," he whispered. It was the first real sign of recovery. And it happened the moment things calmed, even just for a while. Thatcher sat beside them both, laying the revolver down in the sand. The weight of it had settled deep in his chest. He hated holding it, hated needing it. But tonight, it had meant survival. He looked at Branwyn, whose white coat was streaked with dust, but whose eyes were still sharp. There was no blood on the wolf's muzzle, just resolve. They had protected something fragile together. something worth saving. And in that strange union, Thatcher felt something shift inside himself. A wound he'd carried for years, one that had nothing to do with land or wolves, felt just a little lighter. The wind returned, softer now. No longer carrying fear, just cold and quiet. The fire cracked again, and above them, the stars blinked awake. Thatcher didn't speak. He just sat, watching Finnick lower himself gently to the ground, still breathing, still fighting. Branwyn lay beside him, calm again. There was nothing left to do tonight. No more plans. No more threats. Just the long wait for sunrise. But even then, Thatcher knew the story wasn't quite over. One more day. One more moment. And then, maybe they could all begin again. The first rays of morning touched the desert with gold. The chill faded slowly, chased off by the warmth of a new day. Thatcher Boone sat with his back against a stone, legs stretched out, hat pulled low over his brow. He hadn't slept, but he didn't feel tired. The long night was behind them, and for the first time in days, there was no tension in the air. No sounds of danger. Just the wind moving soft through the brush. Finnick was awake, standing now on shaky legs, taking a few slow steps across the sand. It wasn't graceful, but it was freedom. Branwyn followed close behind him, his body relaxed for the first time. Thatcher watched them both in silence, hands resting on his knees. There were no words that could explain what had happened out here. No story anyone would believe. A wolf and a colt surviving together. A man finding purpose again. It sounded like something written in dreams or old books, not in dust and blood. But it was real. Every moment of it. The pain, the fear, the stillness. Real. And maybe that's why it meant more than anything else had in years. For Thatcher, this wasn't just about saving an animal. It was about remembering how to care. How to stay. How to choose life, even when it's messy and wild and uncertain. He stood slowly, stretching sore muscles, and walked to where Finnick grazed gently on a patch of dry grass. The colt looked up, ears perked. Stronger. Brighter. Alive. Thatcher reached out and brushed a hand down his neck. "You're gonna be all right, kid," he said softly. "You made it." Branwyn stood a few feet back, watching. The wolf's job here was done, whatever it was. He stepped forward once, then looked to the horizon. There was no ceremony in it, no drama. Just instinct. Just truth. And then he turned and walked away, into the desert, leaving behind 2 lives he had helped keep breathing. No leash. No thank you. Just the quiet path of something wild and noble. Thatcher stood there for a while, watching the wolf disappear into the rising heat. He knew he'd never see Branwyn again. Not like that. Maybe not ever. But that was all right. Some things are meant to pass through your life just once, leaving more behind than they take. He turned to Finnick, who followed him without hesitation, step by step. Together, they headed toward the truck, the desert opening wide before them. A new day. A second chance. And in the quiet beat of that moment, Thatcher knew, this story didn't end here. It simply began again, under the sun.